Hi there, I'm Beth, and normally on this channel I am sharing my Midwestern garden that I am trying to cram as full of native plants as I can, while also creating a garden that I love just as much as the pollinators. Today is a little bit different. I wanted to share some thoughts about the native gardening movement because I ran across this article by Marianne Willburn, and it kind of inspired me to share my thoughts. So today is more of a video essay, but then don't worry, next video I promise will be more plant-based. I'm going to be sharing highlights from my prairie garden in the summer, kind of peak bloom time, so please stick around for that. Subscribe if you haven't already, if that sounds interesting to you. So I feel like the backlash has finally arrived for native plants. So a few years ago, I noticed like it was kind of picking up steam, getting a little more mainstream. And I kind of thought to myself, okay, this is sort of like the beginning of what could be a trend, or we will see if it becomes a lasting change in the way that people garden. So I feel like we are now at that moment of, are we going to move on from it like a trend, or is it here to stay? So from the moment that I started to learn about the ways that native plants could address some of our challenges that we're facing, like insect decline or climate change and some of the associated problems that come with climate change, I knew that I had to do something. I was just starting to get into gardening, and I knew that my garden was a place where I could do something meaningfully to do something about the things that were happening. In the last 15 years, though, I feel like a lot has changed. Like, I went from being like this total weirdo to now kind of everyone knows about native plants and what they are. People, I think, are at least curious, if not really excited about including them in their garden. And anyway, I ran across this article on Garden Rant by Marianne Willburn, a rant entitled "In Defense of the Gardener's Voice." And I heard about it by way of a garden podcast that I also kind of stumbled on by accident. I think it's been around for a while, but it's just not something that I had come across before. The Garden Mixer, I think, is the name of the podcast. And she was on the podcast sharing some of the thoughts from this article. So some of what I'm talking about came from that podcast and some of it from the article. And by the way, if you would like to read her full article, I encourage you to do so. I'll put the link in the description. And since I began writing this video post, she actually has put out another article called "Wild Fatigue, a Case for Tidy Gardens," which is in a similar vein as the article that I am talking about here. And she shares kind of some of the same concerns there. So incidentally, I feel like this is a viewpoint that I think a lot about when I am gardening in my own garden and when I'm creating content on my channel. I very much want people like Marianne Willburn to embrace native plants in their gardens, and I hope to create a garden that makes these kinds of gardeners, people who are in it for the artistic and aesthetic beauty of gardening, to realize that native plants have a place in those gardens too. It's not just for the bugs, right? So I really appreciate this perspective, and I very much want people with that perspective to embrace native plants. So I was anticipating a reaction like this eventually. I hadn't seen it anywhere till now. But anyway, I kind of figured it was coming. I thought it would be more coming from people who had started to do this and then realized they had like gone in too deep and needed to take a step back. But I did imagine there might be some viewpoints like Marianne's as well. People who are, happily gardening, but all of a sudden they're sort of feeling like they're being scolded for doing what they love to do. So anyway, I wanted to share my thoughts today, kind of on the state of native plants and native gardening, ecological gardening, whatever you want to call it. And I want to thank her for this article because it kind of helped me think through how I look at some of this stuff and clarify my thinking. And I think it's a viewpoint that represents probably a lot of gardeners feel this way. So I also wanted to share some critiques And also to just say right off the bat that I agree largely with what she is saying, and I'll get more into that in a little bit. But I do have some critiques that I wanted to share as well. I agree, though, with her larger point, which just comes down to the fact that gardening should be a joyful activity. And there are a lot of different ways that people are going to garden, and that's great. So just to give you like a little summary of her take before I get into kind of my thoughts about it. Her perspective, she felt like a few years back when people started kind of bringing in an ecological lens into gardening, she was really embracing that. She found it really liberating, you know, like using less pesticides, using your own compost in your garden, things like that. So she says she appreciates this ecological lens, but feels like we're moving towards something different, something more like blurring the lines between ecology and gardening. And in her view, they have different roles to play. So she also takes to task kind of the scolding tone that she sees in a lot of people in the movement and calls it kind of a religiosity among the native plant movement, and then concludes by sort of staking out the gardener's territory as this artistic pursuit and native plant movement as kind of just sucking the joy out of that. So my thoughts, just starting out with kind of what I agree with. Gardeners are not anybody's enemy. And here's why. Gardeners are going to garden. And any changes that they make with how they do their gardening are going to, they're going to stick with it because they love to garden. So any change that they make is a positive in my view. Even if it's incremental, even if it's just a little, any change that happens in a gardener's yard is going to be a lasting change. And I think that's really positive. I agree that at times the ecological gardening movement does sort of make a moral judgment on some of the practices and choices of how people do gardening. So there's a lot to unpack there, though. So she argues that there's like a tone and an almost religiosity to the way that people talk about native plants and what they're doing. She has a lot of quotes from different high-profile gardeners and kind of thought leaders in the space. And she also mentions like the vibe on social media, which, I mean, sure. I thought some of it was really fair. Some of it was a little sensationalized. So, you know, social media, people are going to be out there trying to get as many clicks as they can. And unfortunately, usually the way to do that really easily is to say really inflammatory things or make people angry. So I feel like that's kind of to be expected. Like, welcome to 2026 social media. As far as some of the authors that she brought up, I mean, sure, some of them, oh, is it raining? I think it's raining. Sorry about that. It's raining outside. I had to come in. Anyway, let's see. Where was I? So as far as some of the authors that she mentions, some of her comments were fair, some less so, kind of head scratchers even. So she mentioned Ben Voigt. I would certainly agree. He kind of leans into the us versus them sometimes, like this, the old way of gardening is death type of messaging. But I thought it was a little far-fetched to lump Doug Tallamy into this. She kind of took issue with his, I think he stated in one of his books that like changing how we garden is required and gardening with native plants is required. And he now I think famously has this like 70% natives, 30% other things rule, which she took issue that it's like this like rule or requirement. My thought about that was like, I mean, I have seen him speak many times, like videos up on YouTube. I've read a lot of his books. I have never gotten the impression that he is like scolding anybody. I think his tone is usually very much like inviting people to enjoy the natural world that they can discover in their own backyard. Because he's an entomologist, he's really excited about all of the different bugs basically that you're going to be seeing if you have the right kinds of plants in your yard for them. So I thought that was a little bit far-fetched. I mean, I do think there's a difference between kind of like taking issue with hyperbole or someone sort of like having like a kind of like a us versus them or there's only one way to do it kind of a tone versus stating your professional opinion and laying out some facts of like what are the challenges that we are facing and how can native plants be part of that solution. I mean, like he's an entomologist. Like he's stating his professional opinion about what it will take to kind of reverse some of the insect decline we're seeing. He's not name calling, he's not taking a harsh tone with anybody. I always felt like he's very much inviting people into the native plant movement and adding native plants to their yard. So I did feel like that was a bit far-fetched and maybe a little bit thin-skinned to be like complaining that Doug Tallamy is telling her she has to make changes to the way that she gardens. But, obviously everyone can do what they want in their own garden. But I think it was a little whiny to like say that Doug Tallamy is like saying these horrible things. Anyway, coming back to gardeners not being the enemy though, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this because in my town, and probably many others as well, my town has started to think about ways that they can encourage eco-friendly planting and like have some sort of a comprehensive plan for how they will address climate change. One of those things was they were thinking about changing the rule. It was at one time like illegal to plant things in your parkway bed, the grass next to the street. And of course, I think many people do, even though it's technically not allowed, but they decided to make this change and then encourage people to be planting there. And then we're kind of like, well, what kind of rules should we make up about how we're going to implement this? Should we make a 70% native rule, or should we just leave it up to people? And like my feeling when I think about it from that perspective about like what steps are we taking to encourage people to plant more natives, I'd say absolutely not. Let's not make rules like that. In my opinion, if people want to go to the trouble to remove their grass from their parkway to plant anything, like that is a win. That's great. So when I think about things like that, like what action are we taking to encourage people? I always say like gardeners are not the enemy. Let's encourage gardeners to get out there and do gardening. I kind of think about this too, like when I think about like people who might be potentially interested in ecological gardening, it's like a Venn diagram of gardeners who might start to do more like native plants on one side, and then people who know that it's something that they should be doing, but maybe don't know a lot about plants, don't particularly enjoy gardening on the other. And there's like the middle of the Venn diagram is like the ecological gardeners. They want native plants and they are gardeners. There's a way that people from both sides can sort of wind up in the middle. But I do think about like, to what extent does each group sort of wind up in the middle? How many of these people who don't necessarily like gardening are gonna become gardeners, who just like they're just trying to do their part right now with native plants, but maybe they get the gardening bug, versus like the people who are gardeners who are changing the way that they do things. So I always kind of wonder like how many of each of those groups of people end up in the ecological gardening movement, or like what are the implications of either of those groups just kind of like staying to the sides of the Venn diagram and not changing how they look at what they're doing. So I feel like that's like a valid question. I don't have an answer to it, but in my mind, I feel like gardeners, because they're out there, they are getting their hands in the dirt, they are looking at the things in their garden, they are appreciating the life that they see. Like, even if they're not like 100%ing the native plant thing, to me, that's fine, because these are people who go outside and get their hands dirty and are noticing things. And I feel like just those activities, you're naturally going to start to, especially if you have awareness, like all the ways that your garden can be a benefit, like you're going to start making changes that are positive for the environment. So I'm inclined to think that it's a positive if gardeners are doing gardening. And I, of course, heartily welcome people who are planting natives because they feel like that's the right thing to do. I just feel like my gut tells me that people are more likely to stick with something if they find it to be joyful. So, like, as an example, I try to make changes towards sustainability in my life, like avoiding plastic, for instance. But, it feels kind of like a hopeless task sometimes, and it's not something that gives me any joy whatsoever. And, when life gets busy or I'm stressed or whatever, like a lot of that stuff just falls to the wayside and I don't do a very good job of it. So I feel like it's the same kind of thing. Like if you're planting natives and things start to get tough, like it's possible that a lot of that is going to fall to the wayside, or you have to be paying someone to keep up with the maintenance. And many of you probably know this because I'm assuming many of you have native plants in your gardens. Native plants can be a little more challenging than the like horticulturally bred plants. They're wild, right? So they're not bred to like be well behaved or like all of these other things. Like a lot of plants are just bred to like be a little bit easier to work with, which is not the case with natives. There's a really steep learning curve in some cases about how fast they're going to spread or reseed or what kind of conditions they need. And that can be a lot for people. So I don't take lightly that someone wants to invest the time into learning about plants of any kind and figuring out how to make them grow. Because I think there are probably a lot of people who want to plant natives and then maybe don't know a lot about them. And if you're not learning about them, maybe in 2 years you have a sea of goldenrod in your backyard and you may be having second thoughts about your decision to plant natives. So I just wanted to like put that out there too, because I think that's real. So gardeners, not the enemy. So now to some critiques that I had. So on a few occasions, Marianne Willburn brings up British gardens and garden designers to make some of her points. And while there is a lot to be learned from the ecological gardening movement over there, I think there's some difference in context that is relevant. The UK and Europe are being affected by climate change differently than we are in the US. So they're closer to the polar ice caps, and which are melting. So there's a lot bigger swings of temperature. They're getting a lot more temperature extremes and change than we are seeing here. And it might actually make sense for someone in that context to be looking a little bit further afield for plants that are going to work in a rapidly changing climate. So that's just one piece of that context. The other thing is that the UK actually has very little wilderness, especially compared to the United States. It's been farmed for thousands of years, and this notion of a sort of wild landscape is almost alien to the UK. Like that's not part of how they're thinking about what they're doing necessarily, which is different from here, where we do have wild ecosystems that we can look at and see what the relationships are between different species in an ecosystem. So the leaders of that gardening movement, ecological gardening movement over there, are kind of like tinkering and seeing what is creating greater biodiversity. Whereas here, just to paint extremely broad strokes, we have these intact ecosystems and we have an understanding of some of those relationships between species. And we're looking at, like if we take this particular species out, if it is extirpated, then that means that also this, insect that relies on that is also gone from that ecosystem. So yes, there are a lot of generalist species that can use a lot of different plants, including exotic plants, but we have these intact ecosystems and we can see how the relationships are crucial to maintaining the biodiversity that we have. So this leads me to my final thought about this, which is I think as ecological gardeners, native plant gardeners, whatever you want to call it, we do need to think about how we are inviting people into a new way of gardening. But we also can't just bury our heads in the sand and just ignore facts that are inconvenient to us. I was finally able to come outside today after more than 24 hours of literally hazardous air quality because of wildfires burning thousands of miles away from me. I can't simply just pretend that there's no smoke just because I want to go outside. In the same way, it is just an undeniable reality that there is massive insect decline. And where I live, storms are becoming more severe with the potential for increased flooding and increasing the strain on our sewer systems. Like, these are just things that are reality now. And native plants are an important way that we can mitigate a lot of those things. I do feel that if you understand the problem and how your garden can help, why wouldn't you take action? I have a hard time understanding a perspective that says, yes, I understand all that, but I take offense that you're saying that something is required of me. I think it's just maybe a little short-sighted or even naive. We are facing some pretty incredible challenges to our natural world, and many of those challenges have garden-shaped solutions to them. And to me, that is such an incredible opportunity. And don't get me wrong, I absolutely do see what I do in my garden as artistic. To me, that is like a huge part of what I love about gardening. But any medium has constraints to it. I consider using natives to be one of the constraints of my artistic medium. At the end of the day, of course, we can do whatever we want in our gardens. Maya Angelou says it best, though. Do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. Thanks so much for watching. I promise that my next video will be more plant-based and less of me talking. And I'm just about done with a patio project in my backyard. I've been building a patio. So I'll be sharing that project here pretty soon too. So stay tuned for that. Bye-bye.